we've gone through now, we've made our way down the supply chain. We've talked about the overall economics of food waste. We've talked about food waste at the grower and food producer level, at the retail level, and Brad just covered a little bit of the consumer level. So the next stage here, the next step here is we're going to continue along that consumer level, but what we're going to talk about now is some of the behavioral aspects of food waste at the consumer level. So we have with us today Professor David Just, and he's going to talk to us about the role of nudges, and he's going to explain what nudges are as well in reducing food waste. But just to quickly introduce David, he's the Susan Eckert Lynch Professor in Science and Business in the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. And his research focuses on food and agricultural economics and at the intersection of behavioral economics as well. So if I think we've got David here. Yep. So with that, I'll let David introduce himself and take it away.
Thank you very much, Aaron. So let me see, I will share my screen. Hopefully that's visible.
Looks good.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about how we can apply behavioral economics to the problem to policymakers and academics alike. There's actually been a whole lot of talk about doing behavioral economic work along these lines, and figuring out exactly what we can do to sort of leverage behavior and get people to waste less food. Unfortunately, vast majority of this is all sort of brainstorming and very little actual action. And I guess I'm not actually going to deviate from that. So I'll apologize for that up front, because very little work has been done in this respect. But let me first introduce you to what behavioral economics is and why it might matter here. When it comes to food decisions, we make hundreds of food decisions a day. I think most people, when they first hear this, they think, well, wait, what do you mean? I eat like 3 times a day. How can I be making hundreds of food decisions? But we make decisions not only about, what items we're going to eat and which items we're going to eat together, but when we're going to eat them, where we're going to eat them, who we're eating with. All of these little decisions actually impact how much we eat and what types of food we eat, and what sort of health results and other results we get out of that food behavior, right? When we start thinking about what might be useful in terms of food waste, the number of decisions is vast, right? We have to think about managing inventories of food in the home, and those inventories are large. And I can tell you, you don't have to have a very large household before you get to the point where you can't quite remember everything that is in your inventory at home off the top of your head. You need to make shopping lists or do other sorts of tricks. If you're going to manage it effectively, it takes some bit of effort. And if we're only operating on working memory, that's we're going to end up making bad decisions, right? And unfortunately, because it takes effort, that means we're not going to end up oftentimes putting in the effort necessarily to take advantage of what we have available in our home, and we're going to make purchases that cause waste, right? I just put to you, do you know anyone who rationally and thoughtfully considers food choice and inventory management in their home? I know a few people who I think approach it, but I don't know anybody who actually does it, because it takes so much effort that maybe it's not quite achievable, right? In addition, I guess I would contend most people don't believe they have a problem in this regard, but we have this problem of food waste within the home that's documented, and that food waste is evidence that we have some issue with food inventory management within the home. I don't think anybody intends to purchase things to throw them away, right? I need to hedge that a little bit, and I'll talk about that a little later, but I don't think the vast majority of what gets thrown away was intended to be thrown away. But there are a whole bunch of trade-offs when we start thinking about using sort of psychological tools to get people to purchase the right foods and and eat the foods that they purchase within their home, right? If we're going to try and reduce food waste, we need to find ways to use psychological cues in the environment. And in the environment here means either within the grocery store or within the home itself, to influence their purchase decisions, what they actually get in the store and bring into their home, but also use decisions, because their use decisions are ultimately going to determine what's wasted and what's not, right? So both of those things we're going to need to try and influence, but we need to think carefully about how we influence it, because, well, the arguments for trying to reduce waste are that the waste itself might be inefficient. We're producing food that doesn't actually benefit somebody for some reason, right? That food increases prices and probably exacerbates things like food insecurity potentially. And there also might be some potential disposal cost in addition to the environmental costs that are created by this food. But on the flip side, if we somehow found these perfect sort of psychological interventions that would get people to eat everything that they brought into their home, we need to worry about excess food consumption as well. Excess food consumption, also is inefficient. We have a problem within our country of overweight and obesity. People eat approximately 1/3 more calories than they should, right? So if there are estimates all over the place of how much food is wasted in home, what percentage of food is wasted in the home. If you take some of the upper estimates, which may or may not be correct, and you paired them with the estimates of how much we're eating that we really don't need, it's probably close to half the food we have in our home that we really don't need, right? That is not actually of use. And this also is going to increase prices when we eat more food than we should. And it has this future health cost that acts as an externality, much like environmental costs might. So we've got to be careful about just encouraging people to eat anything, right? So increasing efficiency in this case is going to mean reducing regretted purchases and regretted consumption, both. We'd like to find ways to get people to eat purposefully and to consume those things that they are purchasing at the same time. And we should acknowledge that some waste is worse than others. So there are some things that we should be perhaps a little more okay with people wasting than other things. And I will leave to the environmental economists to determine which those are. So continuing, trying to make this argument for behavioral economics. If we go to your grocery store, average grocery store has a vast number of items to choose from. An incredible amount of choices that you face. 285 varieties of cookies. How are you going to decide which one is the one your family needs, or if your family needs any of them? It is impossible to really trade off all the possible values and attributes of the different foods that you can buy in a grocery store. Instead, you sort of get overwhelmed in this environment. And to a certain extent, you're just sort of looking for cues that will tell you what it is you ought to be eating, right? And when you're in an environment much like that, then you're not thinking through your choices very coldly and rationally. You're instead influenced by a lot of the environmental cues that seem to suggest what is normal to buy, what is attractive to buy, what's going to help you achieve some goal in the abstract, right? So about 50% of people report planning food choices prior to actually eating, according to IFIC. That means about half of people are not planning at all what it is they're planning to eat or what they are going to eat until it's actually time. It's impulsive. It's something they're deciding in the moment. They're not forward thinking. And by not forward thinking, they end up potentially in a situation where I've bought a whole bunch of food that I sort of vaguely had a plan to eat at some point in time. But the moment never came when I actually wanted to eat that food that I purchased. And so it gets wasted, right? And a lot of the reasons we have for eating itself are maybe not what we would think of as rational reasons to eat. A lot of people eat out of stress, boredom. Convenience here looks like it's only about 18% of people report eating out of convenience. I can tell you the studies on this suggest that number must be much, much higher. Because we see convenience as one of the biggest factors in the start of an eating episode, as well as what people choose to eat within an eating episode, right? The whole point of this is to say it's really hard to engage these decision makers with logic and reason because they're not using logic and reason to decide to eat or to decide what it is they're going to eat. Instead, they're taking cues from their environment and from the situation that they're in. And that's the language we need to speak to really have substantial effects. And I'll bring that back up a little bit later. So how do we decide? And there are a bunch of different models people have of how people decide what it is they're actually going to eat. One of the most popular is a dual process model. If you've read the book Thinking Fast and Slow, this is what he's drawing on in that book. It's this idea that, we have sort of these two competing decision mechanisms within us. One is coldly rational. This is the one that sits down and plots out our retirement plan and thinks through all the trade-offs and costs and benefits. And another that's really impulsive that we refer to as a hot state. It's what we want in the moment, right? And really what seems to determine which of these prevails is something along the lines of the amount of cognitive resources we have at the time. So when we're under stress, when we're under time pressure, or when we face some sorts of visceral factors like just being hungry, this hot state takes over, and we tend to go for things that are impulsive rather than things that are rational, things that maybe will satisfy a craving we have for something sweet or something heavy at the moment, rather than what's going to benefit us long term relative to our overall goals, right? This leads us to behaviors where we follow rules of thumb and heuristics, right? So some people will say, okay, well, I'm going to take one small plate worth of food and I will eat that no matter what it is they're serving. And for some items, that's perfectly appropriate. And for others, that may not be enough or it may be too much. But they follow this rule of thumb because it's easy. Habit and tradition are going to impact us, right? So whatever sort of habits we get into. So we might have the habit of preparing a certain amount every night, and it doesn't end up making much of a difference whether the whole family's there or just part of the family. One that I think is really important to consider is insurance. People stock up on food to avoid running out. And that might mean there's some intentional planning of waste within the home, depending on what they're stocking up on, right? If it's long-lived items, things that are shelf-stable, maybe that's not a problem. But if it's, I'm stocking up on huge amounts of lettuce because I just don't want to run out by Friday or whenever that I go shopping next, then it might create a tremendous amount of waste, right? That's something we need to worry about. Okay, there are also what I call projection problems. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because it's probably something people aren't familiar with. But we tend to project onto our future selves the preferences that we have right now, okay? And this manifests itself in a bunch of different ways. So, for example, if I am very hungry, right, I will consider that when I'm planning for the food that I need tomorrow afternoon, I'm planning as if I'm going to be as hungry as I am right now. If I'm planning for the variety that I need in the future, I have this bias where I think I will desire much more variety than I will actually desire in the moment, which both of these types of outcomes can create opportunities where we're creating waste by not really being able to tell what it is we want on our own in the future, which is a bit perverse, right? So things that we need to take account of. When it comes to food and behavioral economics and the types of behavioral nudges we can use, and what is a nudge? A nudge is if we put something in the environment that suggests, a different behavior without actually changing the choice set. So it could be something very simple as making something more visible or less visible, making something a little bit easier to grab by putting it at waist level versus putting it high on a shelf or low on a shelf, right? Changing very, very small things in the environment. Recent studies, PNAS suggests that this type of intervention, nudge interventions, can be very effective with small to medium size treatment effects, but the effects are much larger and border on large treatment effects when we talk about food choice. Food choice is so sort of back of mind and so so reliant on some of these sort of rule of thumb behaviors that we end up seeing a lot of additional impact when we apply it in that particular space, right? And so nudges end up being a very important strategy to affect food choice in what people eat. And most of the work has actually been done in looking at how to get people to eat healthy food versus unhealthy food. And here we're talking about how we get people to stop wasting the food that they've purchased or to purchase food that's not going to be wasted, which is related, but not quite the same thing, right? I mentioned this projection bias. I'm going to come back to that just for a little bit and might try and zoom through this a bit just to tell you about some of the results in this area. So Gilbert, Gill, and Wilson ran a study where people were asked what they planned to buy before on their way into a store. And half of those people were given a muffin on the way in so that they wouldn't be hungry when they got into the store. The other half were not given a muffin until they came out, right? And what they found was that when they were hungry, they made a lot more unplanned purchases. So going into that store hungry led them to be more impulsive in what they purchased. A similar study, Reed and Van Leeuwen, and this is a study I was really referring to earlier, asked workers to select a snack for a future event, a day or so ahead of time, if I remember correctly. And they were randomized to either select this right after they had eaten or right before they were about to eat, so either hungry or not hungry. And they were also randomized to determine, the food that they were going to eat at some future time when they would either have been hungry or not hungry. And what they found is if you're hungry and going to be purchasing for a hungry state, you decide to purchase a lot less healthy items. Whereas if you're full, you'll be less likely to purchase those unhealthy items. So in other words, this level of hunger you're feeling right now affects your ability to figure out what you want in the future, which can cause interesting sorts of biases, right? In addition, there's what's called licensing, which is an interesting phenomenon where essentially when we buy things or eat things that are good for us, we then give ourselves license to do some things that are bad, right? So I had a kale salad with lunch, and so I should be good to have a cupcake with dinner, right? Something along those lines. What's interesting though is it doesn't always have to be a behavior of consumption that licenses some sort of consumption behavior. So for example, purchasing vegetables and fruit might give me license to purchase and then consume some cheesecake along the way. And if that's the case, if that's sort of the calculus going on in my mind, then I might be purchasing things that I will go ahead and let waste and rot that are leading me then to eat unhealthy at the same time. So my waste is also causing me to overeat in some sense. So how can we, apply these sorts of behavioral interventions and nudges in the home and in the store? Well, in the store, we want to encourage things, for impulse buys that are shelf stable rather than things that are really perishable, because we're not sure if people are actually going to eat those straight off or not, right? We want to encourage also things that have sort of this lower environmental impact because the potential that waste is going to happen. Smaller portions so that people aren't wedded to much larger amounts of eating when they do open a package and start eating, and things that are sort of easy to preserve, leftovers. And I'd also like to say we need to discourage these sort of superfluous purchases. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we need to find a way to discourage people from buying things that they already have in the home and just don't happen to remember while they're there in the store. In the home, we need to encourage people to eat the perishables they have on hand, rather than letting them rot. Most of those perishables are going to be things that aren't going to add substantially to their risk of obesity, but there are some, of course, that might. We need to make inventory and restocking easy while making overstocking somewhat difficult, right? I will come back to this issue of just in time if I have enough time. I don't know that I will. And we also need to discourage spontaneous eating. So the principles. Principle one, visibility, right? One thing we can really do is leverage visibility. It's based on this idea of priming. When we see this gorgeous blueberry, suddenly a lot of you have this taste for blueberry in their mind. And the next time you see a blueberry, you're going to be much more likely to eat it because it's activated this latent desire that was sitting in you already, right? We can see this in practice where if you display fruit in opaque bowls, people eat less of it than if you display it in glass bowls where you can see the fruit, right? Seeing activates this sort of desire. And if we think about in the store, right, end caps and promotions for shelf-stable items, those can make these items visible and make them something engaging that will then activate this desire. But I'd also like to think about some of the places like freezer space that is really sterile, and it's actually hard to see what the items are. And in some sense, it's nowhere near as sort of interactive as, say, a produce section where you can see and sort of smell the fruit. Not being able to do that means people are going to be less likely to purchase these items that are similar in purpose, but much more shelf stable, right? So there's opportunities there to try and increase this desire for a shelf stable item. When it comes to the home, making things more visible in the refrigerator, particularly those things that are going to expire or that are perishable, is going to be important. And our refrigerators are not very well designed to try and create that visibility. Things hide in there very, very easily. We often have these drawers for things that are perishable, so you actually have to go to some effort to be to see the things that are perishable in your fridge that are going to go quickly. And if we redesigned it so those things could be seen and seen very easily each time you open the fridge, or maybe even before you open the fridge, it would trigger consumption much earlier. I suggest some items here that could be, technology could help with, right? If we had dynamic displays of foods by expiration, which have been attempted by some smart fridges, but never quite succeeded, those sorts of things could help. Convenience, I already mentioned, is a huge, huge factor in what people decide to eat. And I guess I will leave it at that. Very simple things can affect, have a big, big impact. moving a display from the floor to waist level about double selection of even something like cabbage that's not particularly attractive to people generally. In the home, the same thing could be applied in terms of thinking about inventory tracking. If you make inventory tracking difficult at all, a large portion of people won't do it. But if we were somehow able to use technology to make it effortless to track your inventory, right? And like I said, there have been some technologies that have tried this, but I would say largely failed. And perhaps it could be accomplished right through cooperation between the grocery store and fridge or other sorts of smart home manufacturers. People could then engage in very effective tracking of their inventory. And if they could access it remotely and figure out what was there, they would actually make use of it, right? The other thing I'd make mention of is the kitchen. The way US homes are designed right now is the center of the home. If you want to go from an individual's bedroom to any sort of communal living space, you usually have to walk through the kitchen, which makes it something that triggers eating much more often. And displacing that could make the kitchen something you go to much more thoughtfully and make it something that's a little more rational in terms of how we go about our eating. Similarly, convenience within the store could help make the items themselves could be made in ways that make it easier to make sure we're managing our inventory, as well as easier to use frozen and other shelf stable items in amounts that make sense. And I promise I'm almost done. Okay. Projection. We might want to find ways to trigger shopping events by prompting shopping events after consumption, when people are full, when people aren't going to be prone to sort of impulse buying and increasing their purchases, or post-disposal while it's still fresh in their mind. Oh, I keep throwing away all of the lettuce that I buy because I never actually eat it. Okay. Those sorts of things might help us to rein in purchase habits that are not actually benefiting us, but causing waste or causing causing us to overconsume one way or the other. Let's see. But I want to emphasize, we talked a little bit about technology in some of the earlier sessions. In order for tech to work from the consumer side, it has to be effortless, right? Current smart fridge efforts have failed largely because they ask you to go back and review lists of items and figure out whether you really have it or whether it detected the wrong thing. Your ability to retrieve photos of your refrigerator away from home is really clunky, and sometimes servers don't cooperate, which defeats the purpose. And things can hide. They're not designed very well to really see everything in there. More than that, they only cover the refrigerator and not the rest of the pantry and other things that you might need. I think tech could really be leveraged here for these types of nudges and be effective, but we're not quite there yet. I did just want to make one mention of this idea of just in time. A lot of, the effect of the pandemic has been a lot more people ordering food in, either from grocery store or from restaurants. And there's some suggestion that you could eliminate waste by creating something that's a little more just in time in terms of consumption, which I think would be potentially disastrous because while it would make it so people might throw away less, it also increases transportation costs dramatically and probably creates a much larger environmental problem. But it also creates a problem where, natural disasters and things like that, people would not be prepared. There wouldn't be a stock out. Longer term storage might be actually a better way to reduce waste. Having people, as there are many homes in the West, there are large areas people have to manage extended pantries and store food for long periods of time. That would be useful in reducing waste, so long as people actually make use of those stores. And I will quit there just to say that I think behavioral economics is potentially impactful here, but the real work to figure that out, still needs to be done. There are a lot of creative avenues that are open for application, and I will leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you, David. This really gives us a lot to think about. It's sort of, it kind of gets to the main topic at hand here, which is that whatever we do further up the supply chain may have, the ramifications it's going to have at the consumer level are really going to be dependent on how consumers optimize based on those changes. We have a question in the chat from Kai Robertson that I wanted to mention because it's a pretty compelling question. Maybe you can comment on. She says that retailers are looking to maximize sales and are going to want more unplanned purchases, hungry shoppers. So to get the benefits from not wasting food, one would want consumers to be making fewer unplanned purchases, essentially. And she said she's seen some studies that say consumers blame retailers for encouraging over purchasing. I mean, we've all gone to stores where we see, they've got the sample out and they try to encourage you to buy something. So perhaps that reputational risk would influence retailers to help consumers not over purchase. So the question here is, have you tested any sort of nudges at retail, for example, like pairing retailers' promotional practices instead of buy one get one, or buy one now get one free later, for example? Have you seen anything in that realm about in order to reduce unplanned purchases?
I really haven't. It's actually a very, very good suggestion to sort of convert the impulse to more of a loyalty type of incentive. I would suspect I could get some retailers that might be willing to experiment with it. It's always a little bit tricky to find a retailer who's willing to experiment with anything because margins are thin. But I think that's something they might be willing to try. And you're right. I mean, this is the real trick. Is it seems to be something that would sort of reduce waste in the home, might actually work against their profit motive, which will make it hard to get them on board.
I think what's compelling about that idea too of buy one now get one free later, or something something similar like that in a promotional setting, is we know that retailers have a much greater ability to optimize their inventory, to manage inventory, right? So if we shift, if essentially we're shifting some of that responsibility for managing inventory to the experts, so to speak, it sort of eliminates that not only the cognitive burden for consumers, but just the having to develop that expertise.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think the big key here is taking the burden off of the consumer, because they're never going to do it.
Yeah. The other, I'm curious about. So we're over time, but we're going straight into the roundtable, so it's not it's no big deal if we stay for a couple more minutes. I wanted to ask you, one of the things that I use online shopping apps like Amazon Fresh or Instacart pretty regularly, and essentially it just saves your shopping cart and you more or less just reorder the same thing over and over again. And I guess I'm curious to get your thoughts on, from when you think about this in the behavioral paradigm, is that good or bad? Like, how would you weigh that?
So there's a reason that the retailer sets it up that way. It creates a default that is very easy for you to say, yes, let's do that again. And it's going to take you quite a while before you realize, oh, hey, my whatever this is has piled up, and I don't need to buy that nearly as often. And in the meantime, you'll have purchased several of them, and they'll have made their money off of it. It's set up so it's going to be rare that people actually update and figure out that they can get by with less. So I would think it's actually a bad thing from the consumer's point of view in that sense, but it saves you a whole lot of hassle in terms of thinking through things and working things out. And that's really why people allow it, right? It's just so convenient. And so that's why I think, the opportunity cost on the consumer side, there's been a decision made by the consumer that it's not worth it to manage that closely. And so if it's not worth it to the consumer, but from a policy perspective, it's worth it for it to be managed, then I think then there's a policy interest in creating that opportunity and bridging that gap.
Got it. Yeah, it is incredibly convenient, and it's likely that I won't be abandoning it anytime soon.